Good evening. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the great privilege of being president of this extraordinary college, Hunter College. It's a privilege to welcome you to the second conversation on leadership and the economic crisis, sponsored by the Aspen Institute and the new Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. We once again want to thank Richard and Renee Menschel of the Carina Fund for their generous support of this important event. We are also indebted to Hunter's Ellen Chesler and Faye Rosenfeld and Aspen's Jamie Miller for making tonight possible. I cannot imagine a timelier or more urgent topic than the one we are here to discuss tonight. It is especially appropriate that Roosevelt House is a co-sponsor. At no time since World War II have FDR and the New Deal been such prominent subjects of conversation and debate. We hope our next program with Aspen will be titled, How We Got Out of the Economic Crisis. But no matter what the title, we look forward to continuing our relationship with Aspen in the newly renovated Roosevelt House after it reopens its doors in October. In case you haven't heard this story, Roosevelt House is a 1908 double townhouse on East 65th Street that Franklin's mother, Sarah, had built for the young newlyweds as a wedding gift. I think she waited until they accepted before telling them that she was keeping half of the house for herself. I can't speak for the couple, but Hunter's owes Sarah its gratitude because Eleanor soon found herself spending as much time out of the house as in it, and she quickly became a regular presence on our campus. A strong relationship developed between Hunter and the Roosevelts, and after Sarah died, they arranged for Hunter to purchase the house. Franklin even wrote the first check for $1,000. The restoration of Roosevelt House will be historically accurate while also meeting 21st century needs. But restoring twin townhouses rich with history meant there was twice as much to get right. We have not been without our challenges. For example, because there is no street access to the backyard, we couldn't use a backhoe to excavate the basement and transform it into the auditorium. Instead, it had to all be done with small shovels, and all the dirt had to be hauled out through the front door on 65th Street. And because no dumpsters are allowed on 65th Street, which is a through street, we had to keep hauling the dirt to a receptacle around the corner. But it's all worth it. When we reopen the doors in the fall, a state-of-the-art auditorium will be filled with students in the community attending lectures and debates. The upstairs bedrooms will now be seminar rooms and offices. FDR's library will house our growing collection of Roosevelt memorabilia, and all donations are welcome. The former servants' quarters on the top floor will be converted into apartments for visiting scholars, and everyone will mingle on a beautiful outdoor terrace. Our goal is to celebrate the legacy of the first occupants of the house and their relationship with Hunter. Franklin stood with Mayor LaGuardia on this very stage to dedicate this building in 1940. Eleanor stood here too as the 1942 commencement speaker. I believe that the Roosevelts saw their dreams reflected in Hunter College. Hunter was founded on a commitment to education and opportunity for all, regardless of class, race, ethnicity, or gender, which was quite progressive in the 1870s. In the 139 years since, we have never wavered from this mission. Every day on one of the nation's most diverse campuses, we renew our commitment to making the American dream come true. By ranking Hunter number 8 in the country for best value among public colleges, the Princeton Review acknowledged what we have known all along, that Hunter offers one of the finest educations money can buy at a price that our students can actually afford it. The continued success of the partnership between Aspen and Hunter is a testament to its leaders, including one of tonight's speakers, my friend and colleague, Bob Steele. I also want to thank Lesley Stahl, Dan Gross, and the New York hero himself, Felix Rohatyn, for their participation. To introduce them, I am pleased, as always, to welcome Elliot Gerson, Aspen's talented Executive Vice President of Policy and Public Programs. Elliot.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and I guess we should also be thanking you and Hunter for your own local stimulus program in terms of the renovation of the house and its general stimulus for at least the East Side economy, as you can take the spoonfuls of dirt from the backyard and out to the dumpsters and the like. On behalf of the Aspen Institute, I would like to welcome all of you tonight. Your response to these discussions has been very gratifying, if not inspiring. And frankly, it gives us at the Aspen Institute a renewed faith in what we do, which is to foster intelligent, nonpartisan dialogue for audiences large like this one and small on many challenges that we face. And obviously, as President Raab just said, there are a few challenges that we are facing that are more important than the one that is the subject this evening, so I will let that panel begin momentarily. But before I do want to thank Hunter College again, specifically the Roosevelt House Public Policy Program, where we look forward eagerly following October to be hosting events, we hope with great frequency and we hope with many, many years to come. I'd also like to give a special thanks this morning to Ernst & Young, a great partner of the Aspen Institute, almost everywhere where we engage in discussions and programs, especially on our campus in Colorado. This is the first time they've been involved in this program. We are enormously appreciative of that, and we look forward to their active partnership with us on programs like this in the future. Our moderator tonight hardly needs an introduction. She has been a feature in our living rooms with 60 Minutes since 1991. During that period, she has broken some of the shows and, frankly, many of the nation's most important and memorable stories. Before joining 60 Minutes, she reported regularly for the CBS Evening News and was also a moderator for Face the Nation. She has won numerous Emmys and countless other awards for the superb quality of her journalism. We are absolutely delighted to have her here with us in this program. She will introduce her very distinguished panel. Lesley Stahl.
Okay, terrific. You know what? We can't see you. You're all in the dark. I can't tell how many or how great you look, but thank you for coming. I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel. Everybody knows Felix Rohatyn. He's now president of the investment banking firm Rohatyn Associates and author of a wonderful new book called Bold Endeavors: How Our Government Built America and Why It Must Rebuild Now. He has served as U.S. Ambassador to France, and before that he was managing director at Lazare Frères, where he worked for 50 years. In the middle, Bob Steele, former president and CEO of Wachovia, former undersecretary of Treasury for domestic finance under Henry Paulson. He spent nearly 30 years at Goldman Sachs until he retired as vice chairman in 2004, and he is chairman of the Aspen Institute Board of Trustees. And Daniel Gross, senior editor at Newsweek. Nice new format you have there, Dan.
Holding it up, we relaunched our redesigned issue today. Obama's on the cover. If you don't subscribe, give it a look.
In other words, subscribe. He writes the Contrary Indicator column. He also in Newsweek, and he also writes the twice-weekly Money Box column for Slate. He's author of several books on business, including the recent Dumb Money: How Our Greatest Financial Minds Bankrupted the Nation. We want to know about that. But let me start, if I can, by asking a big, broad question for all of you. And if you answer it, we'll be able to gauge where you're coming from in terms of the economy. And I'd like to ask you to grade the Obama administration as if you're Goldilocks. How do you think they have handled the economic crisis thus far? Have they done too much? Have they done too little? Or have they been just right? We'll start with Felix.
Well, I think that the administration has an enormous challenge with the things that they're trying to deal with, has managed to bring them along, I think, quite well. I mean, you can't be perfect in everything, but on the big issues, I think they have done very well in a very difficult environment. And they still have tremendous challenges ahead of them. And one of them is something that I'd like to talk about a minute, because we went through this kind of thing when New York was going bankrupt. And one of the components of saving the city was the deals we made with labor. And essentially, I could argue that the municipal labor unions financed the recovery of New York City. And I think that for that to happen again would be a very important thing. I think the relationship between the unions and Fiat and the American government is a very, very important and fragile kind of thing. And it will have very far-reaching consequences in terms of how Europe looks at us, how the Far East looks at us. And I worry a little bit about having an appearance of antagonism between the company, its unions, and the government, because these things, as I said, are quite fragile. So I think the president is a man who is exquisitely sensitive to these things. But everybody always has people around him who want to be winners. And in one of these things, there should be no winners. There should be only winners. And that's a very hard thing to arrange, but it has to be. It has to be. You can't walk away from something like this when I don't know how many thousands of people were fired, when dealerships were closed, when companies in Europe were affected, without everybody feeling that one way or another, even though it was difficult, they were all on the same side. And I would think that I would vote for that as an important.
But are you suggesting that they have done anything but be accommodating to the union, the UAW? Because I think there are a lot of creditors who are complaining that the administration is siding with the unions against them.
Well, I don't think it's just a question of the unions, because you have the dealers, you have the companies, you have all of the people around one of these deals who are negotiating pieces and who all want to be heroes. And it shouldn't work that way. And as I said, when we dealt with the city's problems, with unions that were very, very difficult, with banks that were very difficult, with a federal government that was impossible, but ultimately we had to try at least to make people feel in the majority that it was difficult, but in the last analysis it was a good thing to do.
Well, let's ask Bob Steele, because he was there at the Treasury Department when we first began to realize that we had a crisis. You worked with Henry Paulson. How do you think the administration has done since you left at the beginning of the year?
Thanks, Lesley. I think they've done a good job. The way I try to think about how they're handling these issues is the solution to work through the current crisis I think of as having three tracks of issues. First, there's the issue of it just takes time. In the first quarter of 2008, we had a $150 billion stimulus package. And in the first quarter of this year, we had a $788 billion stimulus package. And throughout this whole time, monetary policy has been quite accommodative. So these are things that our government and the Federal Reserve have done to encourage growth and to get the economy back moving. But it's going to take a while for those things to just work through. The second thing I believe that we have to just think about is confidence. And I believe that while there were some questions at the start of the administration, that this economic team is finding its footing. And I know these people and have confidence in them and think that they're making a lot of, as Felix said, very tough and difficult decisions, but they're working through them. And each one, they're doing their best to find the right path, and these are people that we should have confidence in. And the markets, I think, are responding with confidence, and that seems to be coming. Now, that's something that can ebb and flow, but right now I think confidence is moving more to the positive side. And the third ingredient to working through this is capital. And here we've had the government get very involved, and it began with Secretary Paulson and the previous administration of providing support to financial institutions. And it's crucial for our economy to work and for our citizens to have confidence in the economy to believe in the financial institutions. And that confidence has been encouraged through the capital that's been given to the banks. And it's been equity capital, preferred capital, guaranteeing their loans, and in some cases providing support for their assets. So they've made it clear they're going to support the financial institutions, which I think is a strong move also.
So, Bob, I thought you were going to be the contrarian on the panel. I mean, this is going to get pretty boring. I'm going to have to rely on Dan to come up with something here that isn't quite going
since
right.
I have neither the distinguished banking career nor the history of public service that these two gentlemen have, I can presume I'm only here for comic relief. So I will try. I would give the grade an incomplete. And that's because the nature of this problem is it's ungradable to a degree because it's still going on. Earlier this spring, my editor, John Meacham, called me in and he wanted to do some big piece on the stimulus package, and he looked at me and said, will this work? I said, I don't know. I mean, when you have a campaign that has a defined end date, you wake up November 6th and you can determine who won, who lost, which strategy worked, and then we make our judgments based on that. So it's unfolding in real time. Where he's succeeded, we were talking before, and I said that Obama sort of functioned, he's like human Valium. He walks into a room, he exudes this calmness. It's seen in the media, seen by his staff. I think you've seen it to a degree in the country and the economy at large. So we have stabilized the patient to a large degree. Now, a lot of that stabilization work was done in September and October with the now much criticized bailouts and the TARP. We go through this cycle where Henry Paulson, who Bob worked with, was lionized as King Henry. That was actually our cover story. And then, a week later, he was seen as a sap, that he was just giving all this money away. And, of course, in the fullness of time, we'll realize that it's somewhere in between. The banks are now furiously raising capital to pay back that TARP money with interest because they want to be able to pay bonuses this December. So there are real signs of progress and stabilization. I think the reason I would say it's incomplete is because we don't know, for example, that the stimulus is really working. Only about 6% of it has been actually spent so far, and our economy is still shrinking. The job numbers are going in the wrong direction. And our financial system is functioning with, you could either call them training wheels or diapers or something else that young people need so that they can function at a different level. The FDIC is guaranteeing all these bonds and debt that are issued by the financial companies. We're engaged in all sorts of extraordinary guarantees. They're buying mortgages. We can't do that much longer. And so the question is, as the Fed and the Treasury start to remove those training wheels, will this bicycle be able to go under its own power? And that to me is still an open question.
I just want to have a quick aside about Obama's calmness, because I was supposed to be here about 2 weeks ago. I don't know if any of you were here, and I didn't show up. And that was because I was interviewing the president, which I did for 5 minutes. I only had 5 minutes. And what struck me just so intensely was how truly tranquil he is, and what a kind of what a strong center and a calm center he has. It was kind of an overwhelming sensation when I was interviewing him. So we were talking about that before. I wanted to tell everyone that I know Felix Rohatyn from the 80s, when I used to do Face the Nation. I don't even know if you remember this.
Oh, indeed I do. How could I forget?
If ever I did a show where I went after a Reagan official over the deficit, then I got a call from Felix, and he was kind of my cheerleader. Keep going on that. So my sense of you is that you're a deficit hawk, because that's how I met you. And you were encouraging me to keep asking, what about the rising debt? So with that in mind, I want to ask you about your book, which is about 10 different impressive public works projects, government spending projects over the American history, including the GI Bill and the interstate highway system and the Panama Canal and the Erie Canal. It's a very engaging book, lots of wonderful storytelling. But and you're proposing that we now have a new project now. But I want to ask you about that in light of the deficit, which is climbing. I read somewhere that for every $2 where $1 is spent servicing the debt. So, Felix, how can we spend a lot of money on a big new project given the deficits?
I'm glad you asked that question.
Good.
There are two types of financing. One is investment. Investment is when you put money into a project, you keep investing in it, the project grows, it creates profits, it becomes another project, and presumably you've invested enough in whatever is important to you, whether it's school buildings or whether it's shots to the moon. It is investment. It is totally a different thing than financing rifles or financing automobiles, as a matter of fact. It is not a permanent, but it is a semi-permanent way to invest, which results in two things. One is more employment, and the other is returns on capital. And the way you deal with this most of the time, and I'm going to bore you now for another 30 seconds, but I promise not to do it longer, is to have a capital budget. Most countries, states, etc., have two budgets. One is the budget for capital investing. You build a bridge, you build a nuclear facility, whatever, and you account for it as something that is going to last 20, 30, 40 years. And in your accounts, that amortization is done, and the investment comes from the return on the investment that's made when you make these transactions. The rest of the budget is expenditures that you do every day. And that is what should be in balance, not the capital budget, which really doesn't have anything to do with this particular issue. Now, the fact that we haven't been doing this has to do with a lot of congressional arguments of who's doing what to whom. But if you look at any city-state government other than ours, there are two types, two pieces to the budget. One is the capital, and the other is the expenditure. And I'm talking about capital spending which leads to employment as well as to returns. And there's nothing, in my judgment, at this point, that faces this country that is as important as unemployment.
So if you were running things and you wanted to have the next big investment project,
right,
what would it be, do you think?
Well, it could be anything from the equivalent of the Louisiana Purchase to the GI Bill of Rights, which to me was the most incredible thing that ever happened in my life. But if you want to make investment, there's nothing better than education. And the GI Bill of Rights, in addition to education, provided housing, and you just can't beat it. Or you could also go and do what Teddy Roosevelt did in Panama, which is a different type of investment, which is taking over another country. But I think, I mean, I can see arguments to do that, but not here. But well, I mean, I'm sorry about this lecture on accounting standards.
That's what we're here for. We're here to learn.
It's no fun.
But let me ask Bob Steele, who's run a bank, is this the kind of, well, let me ask you, do you look upon what Felix is proposing as wild spending that we can't afford? Or do you think this is something so wise and necessary that we need to do this?
Well, his points are important ones. I do think, though, that you teed up the question that we need to recognize there are two or three tracks of questions we need to focus on. One is working through the current crisis. And I would second the observation that Dan made that we've now sent in the troops to solve the issue. There's going to be a day when we need to pull the troops back out and get government out of business, and that's going to be as complex or even more complex in the process of sending them in. The second issue which you raised is the issue of before we get to the capital spending budget, I think from a discipline perspective, I probably would like for us to make some progress on the operating budget, as you describe it, your distinctions. And we have a regular budget that's out of whack, and we need to get at that. And there's some really hard, tough decisions. And dealing with the entitlements challenge is key and critical. I'm comfortable with the idea, as Felix described, that there are projects that we should look at as investments. Unfortunately, the only problem with this, and when I read the different examples of the 10, I'm more comfortable with decisions made on investments like this by the executive branch, generally speaking, than I am through the process of Congress, because it becomes quite politicized. And in a way, if you could do these things with the stroke of the pen from the executive office, I'd probably be more optimistic on the success. You know, we can have fun, and he'll have his 10, and I'll come up with my 10, which will include Amtrak, the Big Dig, GSEs, or things like that, where government's efforts to steer policy have not been so successful. And I think the less politics involved in these types of things, the better it is. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Well, I certainly agree with the principle that politics is not the best discipline to do anything. But I believe that you could deal with that issue by having a management and governing structure for whatever kind of structure
project.
Whether it's the TVA. So I think you can do this, but I'm very sensitive to the issue of care in doing it, and waste, and the politics that are just humongously awful. But I've been at this for 15 years, and that was just as valid 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And at some point, one has to sort of break the egg and do the omelet.
One of the issues in Washington is that Democrats tend to talk about all spending as if it's investment. Right? 'Cause in education, what is education but an investment in our children? What is healthcare but an investment in ourselves and our future? And Republicans tend to talk about any spending as it's just all wasteful spending. You will encounter Republicans who will talk about all the disasters of the New Deal, like the Triborough Bridge or the Hoover Dam or the Merritt Parkway or that wasn't wasteful. We're still using them today.
Those are his projects.
But in this instance, I think there is a case to be made for spending on something that is maybe not an investment, but that would have, I think, really positive benefits for the economy, and that has to do with healthcare. And when we talk about investments in healthcare, but if we could sort of dial back and look at the last sort of 15 years when we had sort of national healthcare of a form that was being considered, rejected. Since then, we haven't made a meaningful dent in the uninsured. But if you could sort of go back and say, okay, maybe there is some form of national health insurance. GM and Chrysler would not be in the state they're in today, and we would not be having these arguments about creditors being crammed down and the secured creditors not be getting paid, because the UAW wouldn't be sitting there trying to grab onto its health benefits. The reason they owe the UAW money is not for pension money, it's for the health care benefits. When you look at the subprime problem, a lot of the people who did not qualify for regular mortgages and were subprime had bad credit because of hospital bills. Right? You get sick, you don't have insurance, you can't pay, the hospital starts sending collection notices, you have bad credit. A lot of people would probably like to leave jobs they don't like and maybe start a business, but they have someone with a chronic condition. They can't get insurance. This is an enormous drain on risk-taking, on resolving some of these very tough issues. And, if there's my dismay is that it is not spoken about. It's spoken about as a matter of sort of social justice, which is appropriate. But I think it's also a bigger issue of economic competitiveness.
Let me ask all three of you, because you're talking about projects that cost money, and I want to get back to the idea of, can we afford this? There's a lot of complaining about Obama's proposals on health care because people feel this is not the time. We have to deal with the crisis we have right now. Why are you spending more money? There's the idea, Felix's idea, that he calls investments are still going to take some upfront money. Don't we have to deal with the crisis on the table and worry about these things later when we get the boat righted? Maybe I should ask Bob. I'm expecting you to say, we're already spending too much money. We need to stop this.
Well, hopefully I won't let you down. I think that the reality is that we've got to deal with the current crisis, which we're making progress on and that we're moving through. And let's hope, although no one knows, that the majority of the investment required, and my third point was capital for financial institutions, is moving to a better position. And then I think the second stage I would have would be to attack the budget on trying to find out what can we take our budget down to, and really.
And when do we get to that?
And that shouldn't take a long time. That should be this year's work. And then the idea for me is, I said, the next step is to focus on reshaping entitlements. I was always disappointed. I thought that the secretary that I worked for and I were most disappointed that we really couldn't get traction on Social Security. And that's really the easier knot of the two. And my view was that was kind of the low hurdles. And if we could kind of get pretty good on getting over the low hurdles, then we could kind of get revved up and take on high hurdles, which were Medicare, Medicaid. And we made a run at Social Security, and it just couldn't get traction. And it was politics. The president before we had gotten there had a run which was very unsuccessful, and we tried to rev it up again and just couldn't get it going. But I thought the gating was Social Security first and then Medicare, Medicaid. And so that was my take on it.
You know, I'm getting a feeling, and maybe I'm not reading you right, so I'm going to ask you. I'm getting a feeling that you're all pretty optimistic. So I want to get a sense of where you are on the optimism, pessimism spectrum in terms of when we're going to be able to turn the corner on the economy and start talking about things where we can spend more money and people start getting their jobs back. So actually, Felix, I heard this today. I heard that you were put your money in your wheelbarrow, get it out of the banks and wheelbarrow it home, and that you're pretty pessimistic. Is that? I'm not feeling that tonight, though. Where are you?
No, I think realistic. I mean, we've got to look at things we've just passed or something like it. A $3 trillion budget. I mean, 3 years from now, we're going to be another $3 trillion. I never even knew what $1 trillion was until I started reading about it. But there is going to be another whole $3 trillion in our budget. At the same time, we're fighting 2 wars, which that doesn't get mentioned because it's just such a detail, but 2 wars, right? And we obviously have to do health care. We have to educate our children. We have to rebuild our cities.
So it's not our banks.
Well, they'll sail themselves. No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. But this is not a question for optimism or pessimism. This is a question of what are we dealing with? And it's a perfectly good question because I clearly don't get people all that thrilled about my capital spending program, no matter how modest. But these are all things, that's what people get elected to office to do, to make their choices. Because there isn't any one thing that is probably totally so important that it crushes everything else. But if that one thing is 2 wars, fine, but let's then decide what we have to give up in order to win these 2 wars. What we have to give up if we're going to have decent airports and decent landing fields, etc. There are enormous things that are very important to us, and when you're sitting in Europe, which is very important for us in terms of the next 20, 30 years, you look at the world, and it's Europe, ourselves, and over there is China. Yeah. And how do we deal with them? How do we deal with the Chinese who are sitting on $2 trillion on our bonds without? In any case, these are the issues, and I think it's perfectly logical to bring them up. But I don't think it has to be necessarily from the point of view of being optimistic, because this is too complicated to be optimistic.
Pretty gloomy.
Yeah, I tried a little bit differently, Lesley. I think that the good news is the data is now mixed. And for the first couple of quarters of this year, it really wasn't. It was kind of one way, all the wrong way. And there's some signs of improvement. And no one, I'll let, if Dan maybe has an opinion, but I think that one of his last columns talked about this, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Chairman Bernanke, used I think it might have been on your show, the green shoots analogy. But I think there is some evidence of things getting better in certain parts of the economy, and that's a progress. And you have a housing overhang, and in certain places, very little progress is being made. In Nevada and Arizona and Florida, there really hasn't been much improvement. If you look at California, where the economy is creating jobs and the prices have fallen, you've now seen inventory shrink from 11 or 12 months to 5 months, and there's no new construction, so we're going to get that market back in balance. jobs are still being lost, and it's terribly unattractive when we're losing jobs, but we seem to be losing jobs at a slower rate. And there are other parts of the economy that are doing better. So I think the good news is that the data are turned mixed, and that's the right way to think about it.
I actually think things are a little better. I think we're really skewed by, where we sit. When you put two journalists and two investment bankers, it's like a gathering of the glum. We have two industries that are contracting 30 or 40% that have a sort of existential crisis. It's appropriate, I guess, that Waiting for Godot is now playing on Broadway again because we don't know what we're waiting for, when this will end, will there be these institutions. Just as we have the Fresh Air Fund to bring underprivileged kids out to sort of prosperous suburbs, I think we need a version of that to bring bankers, overprivileged bankers to the Midwest. I was in, there are places that, sort of were not cooking through the boom, that were sort of muddling along. They're still kind of muddling along. I was at in Madison, Wisconsin for a week. The biggest industries there are education, the university, healthcare, and the state government. They're all suffering, but they're not down 20 and 30%. They're down a few percent. If you go to Cincinnati, Kansas City, things are not so awful. But so much of the perspective, we've conflated the health of the financial system in Wall Street with the health of the economy at large, and the media, which is very much into navel-gazing, is looking at itself and concluding that everybody else must be doing that badly.
Well, let's talk about the media for 1 second, because that's a really important point that you're making. We're suffering, and so therefore we're a little gloomy. Talk about what's happening with Newsweek for 1 second. This is very interesting because the new magazine is based on an assumption that they need to shrink their circulation. The idea was always, let's grow it. Mm-hmm. It's coming down, 40%, deliberately shrinking it. Can you explain that to us?
Sure. Well, for years, the big magazines, the idea was you basically give away the circulation, get as many subscribers as you can, but essentially give it away or close to it, and then tell your advertisers, hey, if you want to reach 3 million people, you pay $400,000 a page. And then you have to go out and manufacture all those. Well, we got ourselves into the cycle where the cost of printing and ink and postage went up, and then in the last 2 years, advertising has fallen off a cliff. So now we're manufacturing hundreds of thousands of magazines that people don't really want. So we have determined to make people actually pay for it. We're going to double the circulation price, which still comes out to 80 cents or $1 a week, which is less than, you can get, 2 cappuccinos at Starbucks for that?
He's
or
selling us.
Go somewhere on Madison Avenue and get a bowl of pasta. $50. Bargain. And the idea is that we will lose some chunk of our subscribers. We'll be left with a core that is more engaged, that wants the magazine, and it will tell advertisers, here we are. And I think this is something if you go back home tonight and look at the magazines you get and then put how much you pay for them. Vanity Fair is $10 for a year. It's nothing.
It's nothing.
And we have devalued ourselves in the media by giving it away in various formats, whether it's online or in print. And if we want to survive and be around for 5, 6, 7 years, we're going to have to start making people pay for it.
Well, that was the model. That was the advertising model, and we're all in the media having to figure out a new model. But let's stay with Bob Steele for a minute and ask about what's going on with the banks. I was intrigued to read something about the stress tests, and I'd like your evaluation of them. I read that they were kind of gamed because the federal government allowed the banks, helped the banks make profits in the last quarter by allowing them to borrow money from the federal government at 0%, and then they were allowed to lend money back to the federal government for profit. They therefore had a profit that they were able to use in the stress test to show that they had a profit. Were the stress tests fair? Were they gamed? What's your opinion?
Well, so let's start at kind of the beginning. The regulators and supervisors decided that it was, as I said earlier, for our economy to work, business and consumers and people that use banks need to have confidence in the system. It's really the lifeblood of how our economy works, is to have confidence in banks. And they've made substantial investments, and the vocabulary they've used in lots of hearings and lots of other press opportunities have been that they stand behind the large and important institutions. And these 19 banks, I forgot, they're 85%, I think, of the banking system. So this is really the lion's share of the banks. So if these 19 banks, if you can say they're strong, then that should be something that gives confidence to people that our banking system is solid. Now, the stress tests weren't about just 1/4 of earnings, so I don't kind of buy the gamed idea. The stress tests were when the Federal Reserve and the New York Fed evaluated the balance sheets of the banks and said if things deteriorated to a certain level, what would these assets look like and how would they perform? And it was forward-looking. It wasn't just about 1/4. And so they came up with the idea that a significant amount of capital needed to be raised, and that started to happen. And it's been raised from the public markets, where the banks have raised equity in the markets. And I think that's a refreshing observation to suggest that these banks can attract investors at the current prices who will invest. And likewise, for a while, the FDIC had guaranteed certain of the debt issuance. Now banks are issuing without that guarantee too. So I think, to go back to Dan's analogy, that some of the bikes are starting to ride without the training wheels, and that's a good thing. And so I think that's hopefully confidence producing. And nothing
and what
like...
about you? You personally, do you have confidence in the way the stress tests were conducted? I think you
Sure.
do.
I think that there was pushback and debate. Not all the banks liked the way the regulators looked at it. But, the regulators are kind of re-earning their confidence too. As our president said just a week or two ago on TV, there are 3 culprits in this story. And they are Wall Street, they are Main Street, that basically took down too much debt and overextended themselves, and they are Washington. And I take Washington in the very broadest sense to mean people that are in the Congress, people in the administration, and people in the regulatory area. And all 3 of these groups have some work to do to reestablish their bona fides, all 3. And I think it's pretty easy to focus on just one. And so, we'll take turns. I'll bash Washington, he'll bash Wall Street, and he'll bash. But that's not right. It's really a matter of all 3 of these, in my view.
Felix, what was your impression of how the tests were done, and how do you feel the banking community is doing right now? And what about, also comment on what Dan said about how these banks just want to give bonuses at the end of the year?
Well, you're asking me these questions?
Yes.
I think that today the banks are certainly better off, stronger, more deserving of support than they were 2 months ago, 3 months ago, where we were really sort of walking on the edge of the cliff. And when Bob says, there were 3 different entities that were all involved in this. One was the regulators, the other was the banks. He's absolutely right. I mean, there were 3 parts of the financial community that totally blew it over the last 10, 15 years. Wall Street, not so much Main Street, the regulators, and the banks. What the stress test did, and whether they were absolutely on the edge of being conservative or not in terms of the finances, you can argue about that. The fact is that they succeeded in bringing back confidence. And if they succeeded by being a little bit generous in their allocations of profit and losses, God bless them. And I don't think anybody would question that. I think, first of all, every one of these things has fairly large margins where you can go one way or the other, especially in accounting, which God knows has the most flexible way of looking at anything. But I think the thing was well done. I think it was scary when we started, because if they had gone down, it would have been very bad. And I just hope they keep continuing this recovery. At some point, the one thing that hasn't happened essentially in the banking industry is a major change in management. And it seems to me that there's enough, and you don't want to do these things in the middle of one should remember, especially when it comes to bonus time, that there are still some open accounts here with respect to who deserves what.
Yeah, I think, if you are conspiracy minded, you might say that the stress test was all concocted. They all get good grades, and then they all go out and are able to raise capital because their stocks have just gone up, and that Wall Street gets a nice little stimulus package because there are no public offerings, but they're underwriting all these huge new, so everybody's happy. But that would give a degree of foresight to banking executives and regulators that we know that they don't have. That said, I think you can, I don't know if you guys would disagree with me or not, but I think you can make the case that we no longer have a sort of systemic banking crisis anymore. There's a large amount of stability, banks that are raising their own capital, raising their own debt. Every Friday you go to the FDIC's website, a bank fails, usually a small one. That's what happens when you have a bad credit cycle. They get nationalized for 10 seconds. The FDIC finds a buyer, a stronger bank who wants the branches, so the management is gone. This is what's supposed to happen when you have failure. And the FDIC sort of taxes the industry. They pay deposit insurance. They're going to draw down that fund, but they will replenish it when things are better. I think we still have a Citigroup and, to a lesser degree, a Bank of America crisis. In other words, two huge institutions that the system can't handle their failure. And their degree of screw-up was so colossal that it's inflicting huge costs on the taxpayers, on the institutions themselves, stressing the system, and still posing this challenge as to how you handle those two big issues. The dollar values involved, and you throw AIG into the mix, which isn't really a bank, it's its own little island of incompetence and debacle. But so, I feel like that the banking system as a whole, it's not in great health, but it's surviving, it's on the road to recovery. We have these protocols for dealing with their failure. We still have these three big outliers that we still don't quite know what to do with.
Government is deeply involved in them. I think it's time to invite the audience. I had a little cue from over there. Invite the audience to ask some questions. I don't know if we're going to be able to see you, so here we go. Maybe we'll turn some lights on in the audience. Is there somebody?
Lesley, over to your right, Lesley.
Okay, we really
the center aisle, Lesley. The center aisle to your right. You can't see, but we can wave at you.
Okay, I see you. You see him? There you go.
First, if I may make a comment, I want to point out apropos of something Felix said, that we're all sitting in a building that Jennifer opened tonight by saying was dedicated by Eleanor Roosevelt, which means it was one heck of a good investment because it's at least 60 years old and generations of Hunter students have gone forth from this very stage to productive lives in the country. But I'd like the panel, if they would, to comment on the role of the United States in the world economy. You've talked a lot about domestic events, but not much about the world. And are we at one extreme prepared to lead the world economy back? Or alternatively, do you see the U.S. as yesterday's news, no longer having a resource advantage, no longer having an intellectual advantage, and will we be able to survive in a world economy?
Who wants to take that one on? Felix?
Well, our position in the world obviously is not what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, essentially because of the problems we've had in our economy. But to the rest of the world, I think we are still the beacon that people look to, both culturally, intellectually, and still with respect to defense. I mean, I think we are the defense of democracies in any shape or form comes back to us. Now, that can be thrown away also in the next few years, depending on what the next administration does and what we feel about it. But to the Europeans, we are the world. I mean, they will never agree to being on that view, but that is the reality. Having France rejoin NATO, whether it was just a gesture or anything, but it was a very important thing. So I believe that unless we mess it up, we have to strengthen our economy because that's always been the sort of the pedestal of our power. But as long as we have a president who understands the morality issues, as long as we have a judiciary system that understands that we don't torture people, or if we do, we ought to punish those that are doing it, then we will be back to where we should be, assuming we also make the efforts to even out our budgetary problems, which is going to be much more difficult and much easier said than done. But there is no capital of the world other than the United States in any way, shape, or form.
It's very hard for us up here to see, so I hope we're going to... There we go.
The real problem is jobs and revenues. Now, how do you support a service society without a wealth-producing industrial base? So how do you bring back the base? In order to do that, how do you create demand, both consumer and industrial demand?
This is perfect for Dan.
And
Me? I was looking at him.
No, I'm looking at Dan because of the book you wrote about spending.
Dan, could you pass these out to the rest of the panel?
Oh, sure.
It addresses the problems at hand.
Okay.
All right, Dan, you've written a book that says
Pass one down.
that we have to start spending again. It's a little counterintuitive.
I think that it was a
That question-
cover story that was my editor's idea. But the premise being that our problem isn't a lack of cash. We have $3.8 or $3.9 trillion in money market funds. If you look at the S&P 500 companies, the non-financial components of that have $600 billion. It's not a lack of cash. It's a fear about investing it. So we do have money to invest. Now, the question is, will we go back to being a producer and exporter of goods as we were in the 50s? There was a unique set of circumstances where the rest of the world's industrial base had basically destroyed itself in the war. We had the global market largely to ourselves and have been, losing that day by day. Obama frequently talks about wanting an economy where we make things again, other than financial products. I'm not particularly optimistic that we're going to go back to being a manufacturing-based economy. Our standard of living is too high. Everybody else has figured out how to make things, and their labor costs are lower. The sort of two things to look for. One is the next big systemic technological push that will hit every part of the economy. We had the steam engine, we had electricity, we had the transistor, we had the microchip, we had the defeat of sort of inflation and globalization. All these things which touched every component of the economy give us a huge collective push. Right now we don't seem to have that, and we seem to be at a loss for what that could be. But in 1992, when after Clinton had won, he had this economic summit in Little Rock where all the greatest economic minds of the country came, and they produced reams of papers and position papers about what we needed to do, the investments we needed to make. And nowhere in those thousands of pages of documents did the word the internet appear. Right? So by definition, assuming there's going to be some big technological change that helps us all, we are probably not going to know what it is.
There certainly seems to be a push to get it do something with green technology.
That goes.
Certainly, everybody's hoping that's where.
That's helpful and useful. It's useful from a geopolitical sense. It will create jobs, but at the end of the day, you're still kind of plug into the socket to get electricity. It doesn't make a fundamental change in the way we arrange our lives. The second thing that I have a little more hope for is this sort of drive for efficiency. There's a sense, I think, particularly among corporations, that the last several years, they really weren't trying that hard. because there was just so much money sloshing around. You didn't have to work too hard to be efficient to make money. And now that we're pinched and we don't see revenue growth, we're going to really start working on this. So the healthcare industry came out and said, gee, now that they're going to do some public insurance, we can really cut the rate of growth of costs in half in the next 5 years because we're going to start trying now. I just got an email press release from American Express. Their re-engineering efforts are going to yield an $800 million savings in the next year. Individuals, companies doing this does give us a kind of boost of productivity. I don't know how long-lasting that is.
Good answer.
Hello? Yes.
I don't know. Can we hear you? Do you have a mic?
Hello? Yes.
Why don't you yell? He has a mic. Then we'll get it to you.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Back here, sorry. Hi. My question for the panel, and I'm glad that all of you seem to, over the course of your careers, have seen the ebb and flow of previous recessions. I'm wondering, how hopeful are you that this current recession will lead to maybe a cultural shift among the financial leaders and the regulatory leaders, cultural shift in terms of leading us away from the kind of hubris that led to the development of these exotic investment products that led to the recession, and also to a greater appreciation of the need for regulation. You had banks that spend lots of money on consultants and lawyers and lobbyists to weaken the regulatory system, and that's been written about as one of the contributors to the severity of the recession. So I'm wondering, how hopeful are you that people will learn from this recession and shift the culture of Wall Street?
Great question.
Maybe I'll start on the back end of the question, and I'll leave some of the issues on the front end about behavioral aspects to others. I think that regulation, I think this is the first time that's come up in this discussion, and I'm glad it did. I think it's too easy, if I could offer a different perspective, to make this a simple more or less regulation. I actually believe pretty strongly that this is really a complicated issue, and to find a simple solution more or less isn't likely to be very helpful. We can play a game, and I'll tell you where I think we need less regulation, where I think we need more regulation. We need less regulation. We don't need 7 or 8 different regulatory agencies supervising banks. That allows banks to pursue the least strict regulatory regime. We need less regulation. We need a strong person, I believe, kind of a supra-OCC. Now, on the other hand, I believe we need more regulation. We need, in my opinion, some type of systemic risk regulator to basically be charged with the responsibility of looking out for issues that are potentially challenging to our economy. I think we had too much regulation encouraging home ownership, not sustainable home ownership. And the whole idea was to measure, can we develop regulation that will encourage home ownership? I think we had too much of it. In other cases, I think we need less. So it's more sophisticated, I think, than just more or less. Almost all the fundamental regulations of our country, of our financial system, were organized about 80 years ago. And since then, we've added components to it, kind of on top of each other, usually in response to a near-term crisis, without thinking about the longer-term perspective. And my suggestion would be we need to look afresh at this and have better regulation, more efficient regulation. In some cases it'll be more, in some cases less. And I realize that's kind of an unpopular observation, because the battle cry today is more regulation will make it all better. I'm not so sure.
But what about a sort of attitudinal change, which I think is really what, I don't want to change your words, but I wonder if you had all these years where laissez-faire, we can self-regulate in terms of the markets. If that was the sort of leading intellectual notion, if we need to shift that and move away from it, there's a new book by Richard Posner, and he's saying that the problem wasn't greedy Wall Streeters or stupid Wall Streeters, because everybody was making so much money you'd have been stupid not to jump in. The problem was free market.
Yeah,
and
I think
that
that's...
you need a wholesale shift in thinking away from this idea that this freewheeling free market is such a great idea.
I just don't think it's quite that simple. And it'd be easier for me just to say, yep, you're right, and then people would go like this. But I don't think so. I think that the facts are the most regulated institutions had some of the biggest problems. Right. Commercial banks. So in some cases, I think we need more regulation. In some cases, I think we need...
Didn't the commercial banks get into these other instruments somehow?
Yes, but they still had regulators, supervisors, bank examiners.
But the things that went wrong weren't regulated. I don't know.
Well, no, the regulators were inside the banks looking at these things too. I just think it's not quite a left or right issue, and I just think that it's going to take time to work this out and figure it out exactly. Now, one of the components in my old firm, original firm, spent lots of years fighting Glass-Steagall and lost. We thought that the commercial bank should stay in their lane and the investment bank should stay in their lane, and so that was changed. And so whether that's good or bad, I just think it's a more thoughtful perspective is needed as opposed to just left or right on the regulationometer would be my instinct.
I would argue, though, that as you mentioned, the Glass-Steagall Act, that I personally think one of the great mistakes that were made was the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, and which was followed by this great thing. So I certainly am sympathetic to the view that we can overdo regulation, but I'm not sure we're so close to that, and that there isn't a long way to go. I think one thing, as a matter of fact, that struck me when this stress test was beginning to get rolled out is that there was no reporting or no reporting on the issue of these toxic securities that are presumably throughout the banking system. And I think if one could have gone a little bit more on the disclosure side for this issue of these toxic securities, and maybe gotten it out of the way as an issue by saying, well, such and such a bank has 37% of its capital in this, I think that would have been helpful. Now, maybe it'll still come. I would assume it will. But as I said, the rest of it, I think, is understandable. But the feeling out in where people live in the real world against Wall Street, against this quick, easy money, against having people worry about whether their 401k is still around, I think it's going to be a hell of a long time before we're out of that, and there'll be I mean, as you and I both know, there'll be congressional hearings on this and that. But we do have to do something about the image and the way the confidence, as you were telling, bringing back the confidence in the morality of an industry, which is a huge industry on which we depend.
The challenge is you look at something, you and I grew up believing that the protector of the investor and the individual was the SEC.
That's right.
And that's an institution that has a challenged position today. And none of us should take any pleasure in that. That's unattractive for our markets. And so how we figure out a way for something like the SEC has to regain a position of respect as someone who is an effective police person for the market, so that everyone is getting a fair deal. And that needs to be brought back. And you and I had incredibly interesting and rewarding careers in financial services. And the facts are that, as I've said a couple of times tonight, financial services plays a crucial role in the economy. And when financial services don't work well and come off the rail, it has a very, very unattractive effect. And it affects those people who are least able to afford it the most. And that's what's happened. And those of us who work in this industry have to take that responsibility and regain that respect.
Well, I think we're going to unfortunately see what the remainders are of these things that have happened over the years, and we have to have this back and as the leading industry in this country. That and Silicon Valley ought to be the things about the future. That, Silicon Valley, and our educational system that we're not paying much attention to. But that will also depend on the experience of the younger people that are going to be coming into our industry, with the background of having watched what had happened, I think that's going to be a big issue.
Well, we are fast running out of time. Dan, did you want to say anything about regulation?
Well, Arthur Schlesinger, great historian who I lived around the corner from here, was associated with Cooney for many years, wrote a book on the cycles of American history and talked about things moving in sort of a 30-year cycle from left to right and back to center. There's a question now as to whether we are now in one of those cycles with finance. There was a period after the crash, 29. The Dow didn't get back to where it was until 1954, and even through the 50s and 60s, people didn't want to buy stocks. We've had a sort of 30-year period where basically Wall Street has gotten whatever it wanted from Washington, regardless of who was in power, every combination. And so the question is now, are we headed into another prolonged period where people are falling out of love with stocks, where the industry is not going to get its way in Washington, where it's not going to have some sort of privileged status? Or is this a sort of shorter cyclical thing? I mean, dial back to the end of the dot-com boom. We thought the investing world had ended. All this corruption was revealed and conflicts of interest. That lasted about 6 months, right?
So you don't know. And I was wondering whether, and just in terms of regulation, whether it's a pendulum swing, where maybe the pendulum just went a little too far in deregulating. And I get your point, Bob. It's a confusing pattern of too much and too little, but overall that maybe it just went too far in deregulation and it needs a course correction. Or whether we're in a period where we're going to see radical change and enormous re-regulation. I'll bet we have the latter, but we'll see. What a great panel. Thank you all, and thank you for coming.
A pleasure.
I hope you found it interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.